Well, welcome everybody. My name is Jim Penrose. I'm the EVP of Cyber Intelligence at Darktrace. Apologize for a slight delay getting started. We were just working through the projector and getting everything set up right. Had a little power bump here, so it's like gremlins are everywhere, you know. Every time I do a demo or a presentation, they follow me around, so, you know, obviously that's what happened today. So what I'm going to talk about today is this concept that there's no such thing as a coincidence in our world, cyber intelligence. And I'm going to talk about how, you know, I see the world and how we can discover new cyber threats using, you know, this concept of making cyber intelligence a discipline instead of just a data feed. So a little bit about me. I spent the last 14 months working at Darktrace as the EVP of Cyber Intelligence. What I do for Darktrace is assess the cyber threats that we see coming inbound to our customers in North America. So across the pitch, we'll see different you know, sort of techniques or tactics being used by adversaries like malvertising or other kinds of unique you know, social engineering attacks. And we'll see that affecting credit unions in Canada all the way through you know, law firms in Los Angeles. And it's kind of interesting how you'll see it kind of sweep across North America and appear in different ways. But regardless of the actual details, you know, the domain names and the malicious you know, attributes that are used, a lot of times it's the same tactic being applied in different places, but with a slightly different sort of, you know, indicator or compromise. So I'm going to talk about those challenges as we go through the talk today. Before that, I spent 17 years working at the National Security Agency, working on all the variants of computer network operations. So, you know, before they had cyber as a buzzword, we had CNO, computer network operations. So worked on computer network defense, defending NSA's internal networks, but also looking outwardly at foreign cyber threats and figuring out you know, the nature of those threats and turning that into, you know, the intelligence products that we would share with the you know, CIA and all the other agencies in the U.S., the DoD, that would take action on that information, and of course the FBI running investigations into those intrusions. You know, and it was really useful to, you know, not just spend time on the defensive side, but also on the more aggressive offensive side doing espionage, because what it does is it helps you appreciate the different approaches you can take to get into a network. And when you have that context, you're able to use that to inform your decisions when it comes to how to defend yourself and where you can concentrate your efforts and time to protect your network. And like most people, after September 11th, I stepped into a counterterrorism role and used cyber operations as a technique to go after terrorist targets and figure out their plans and intentions and uncover conspiracies in progress. Finally, the last thing I worked on was this office called the Operational Discovery Center. And the goal of that office was to figure out the unknown unknowns. So as you might imagine, Edward Snowden leaked a lot of information, sensitive information about how the National Security Agency operates. And there was a need to recoup a lot of lost sources and methods and you know, cyber threat targets that were out there operating who we lost sight of when those revelations happened. So that was the goal. And you know, that particular office I was working in was to try to find those unknown unknowns and get new leads and figure out where to go next. So for me, you know, a formative experience, thinking of this as a cyber intelligence professional here in the private sector now, this happened to me when I was, you know, working in the Office of SIG and Support Information Ops at NSA, and I'm getting ready to leave for the day, and I'm walking down the hall, and I walk past the conference room, and what do I see in there? I see on CNN this breaking news that there's this blackout sweeping across the Northeast, including Toronto as well. And it really, you know, sort of struck me. My heart sank when I saw it, because I thought to myself, oh man, it's less than 2 years after September 11th. Did we miss another big indication somewhere in the intelligence community? Maybe there's going to be a cyber attack or something was going to turn the lights out. Now, you all know that this wasn't a cyber attack, right? It was simply just power lines knocked down and a cascading blackout occurred, right? But it's emblematic of the thing that you never want to happen to you as an intelligence professional, right? You never want to see things show up on the news. Once it gets to the news, it's no longer intelligence, right? It's news. And that means something bad had to happen. The conspiracy that was hatched had to go all the way through and be run, you know, whether it's a cyber attack or a real world attack. That's a fail state, an epic fail, right, if you're in the intelligence business. And a lot of times, you know, when cyber, we spend a lot of time optimizing how we respond, right, to incidents and how we clean up and how good we are in those scenarios. But in the end, that's not intelligence, right? That's a response action, that's news, and dealing with, you know, that information is like a day late and a dollar short, right? So if we're going to develop a competency of discovering unknowns and novel threats and the unknown cyber threats, we can't just keep, you know, polishing our current process. It's not going to work, right? We're really in the business right now of watching the news, right? And watching a news in an ops center, you know, that was there just because if it showed up in the operations center, we saw that there was a crisis. We knew that we had missed something serious and we hadn't done our job right. Now, the nice thing about Twitter is I used to have a picture in here that wasn't a real picture of the outage. You can see there is still some light in the Northeast here after the after the outage happened. And somebody had tweeted to me last week when I briefed a picture that showed it looks like completely black. He's like, that's like photoshopped, right? That was like something, you can look it up on Snopes, and it's like, oh. So the nice thing about Twitter is, you get that feedback within minutes of your briefing usually. So if anybody has anything they'd like to help to improve my briefing, please tweet me after this, and I'll go ahead and put it right on there. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about now is this concept of cyber threat intelligence integration, because I think many people believe that if they buy a cyber intelligence data feed, that's going to be the way they're going to receive indications and warning of new and novel threats. But I'm going to challenge that assumption and assertion that that's what you get from a cyber intelligence data feed. What I'd like to give you as a thesis instead is that you need to have your people thinking in the mindset of an intelligence professional when it comes to doing cyber threat intelligence and using a different approach to figure out what an adversary is likely to do and how they're going to execute a targeted attack against your enterprise, the way an APT would think, or a sophisticated cyber criminal. So, what's Gartner's definition of cyber threat intelligence? It's this gobbledygook, half a paragraph definition. My definition's simple. It's information used to determine where and how you've been pwned. That's pretty much all it is, right? And that's what you're getting out of most cyber threat intelligence feeds today. What is in the typical cyber threat intelligence feed? The IP addresses that hackers are using to do their dirty work, domain names and URLs that they use to execute their social engineering or their attacks, or command and control, infrastructure, etc. Email addresses for the same. And then, of course, the signatures of malware that they're using, whether they are signatures or hashes or you name it, any of those various tactics or approaches to figure out if a piece of malware was already known as bad. Now, from a process perspective, right, we're really good at cross-referencing this information, right? We have a lot of security events. We take our big pile of security events, we cross-reference it versus the threat intelligence, and now we've got a pile of bad, right? Mostly, right? We know it's bad. There's probably some false positives in there, but we assume, right, now we've successfully identified, and we kind of like give ourselves a pat on the back. Yes, I found some bad stuff, and we should do response and remediation. But there's this other problem, right? You get the false negative here. If there's no cross-reference that results in a hit, right? Congratulations, you may be patient zero now, right? You're the victim of a targeted attack. Somebody loves you, right? You're getting personal attention as an individual, as a company, as someone who's a part of the critical infrastructure. You have to expect this, right? It's not like, oh, well, little old me. I mean, I just run a telco. I mean, who cares about telcos? Gee, everybody cares about telcos. What do you think espionage actors go after all day long, and why? They need information on who calls who, when and where and how, right? So of course you're going to be in the middle of that maelstrom. Same thing with power companies or anybody that does that kind of work of providing public utilities. There's going to be a never-ending source of attacks coming your way from sophisticated actors. All right, so the basic bag of tricks, but I just want to emphasize here that a lot of the command and control and exfiltration machines located here in the upper left-hand corner of this diagram, the attacker wants to hide those identities and obfuscate those identities as much as possible so that they're not easily recognizable at your perimeter or within your network. They're going to use that to enable those unknown pieces of infrastructure to enable their social engineering, and then once they've gained an initial point of presence, they're going to enumerate inside your network, look around, look for vulnerabilities, and then hack to the next machine, and then continue to strive for the key database administrator or the network operations guy, desktop admin, somebody who's got the right privileges to achieve their ends, whether that's a big, exfiltration and data breach, building a path across multiple enclaves. It can be a complicated process, and there will be a step-by-step that they go through. Rome typically is not built in a day in these big data breaches. You don't get hacked in the morning and by the afternoon lose your entire lunch. It usually takes a little while for the attacker to position themselves. And then once they find the right perch, they're going to put in remote access tools and something for persistent access so that they can come back to the same place again. And if in some cases they can escalate their privileges, they may even control your entire network. Like it's Sony or in Saudi Aramco back in even 2012, they had 20,000 of their machines wiped out on one day by a network attack. So that's what happens, right, when you lose control of your administrative platforms inside your network. And of course, damage can ensue if you have an attacker that doesn't care about those ramifications or is doing it on purpose. So I'm going to talk a little bit now specifically about the cyber threat intelligence data feeds. A lot of people are using them as a yardstick to measure badness, and the speed of those updates are critical because if you are going to use it operationally, they need to get to you in a timely fashion. But then you get into this kind of situation where if bad reputation is ascribed to an IP address or a domain name or whatever, then the question is, well, how long does it keep the bad reputation? I heard of a company that had some automation put in, and they were using one of these threat intelligence feeds and found out that some Twitter addresses had been used by hackers, right? They were tweeting out some C2 into Twitter and just reading it from Twitter for the command and control. So obviously that means Twitter is used as infrastructure for hackers, so block Twitter, right? That's the logical conclusion, right? So they add it to the cyber threat intelligence feed and they start blocking Twitter. Well, the marketing department and sales and everybody starts going bananas at the company. I can't get my job done. Twitter went away, right? And then they're like, why has Twitter gone away? And they eventually hunt it down to the security department who had the auto magic blocker turned on for things that were coming in that cyber threat intelligence feed, right? So, man, I love automation as much as the next guy, but this is a quality question, right? In terms of what happens, right, if you turn it on and the bad reputation pervades, your process, and then you start interrupting mission in terms of what people are trying to achieve. So, the question you sort of end up with is the more the better, right? I mean, everybody is out there, I think, at least in America and the U.S. government, there's this overall assertion that, the lack of sharing, is the primary issue, right? If we had just had more sharing on all these different fronts of this threat intelligence, we'd be better off. But, I often remind groups that, the bigger the tent, right, for sharing arrangements, the more likely you are to have the adversary literally sitting in the tent there with you, listening to the conversation. And, these are smart adversaries, right? They realize that if they look into the, into the stream and they see themselves, well, I've probably been found out there. Maybe I shouldn't use that same IP address. It's just basic common sense. But to assume that we can vet people out in those scenarios may not be really, really appropriate. So you're left with this kind of need more cowbell situation, right? It's just like that Saturday Night Live skit, right? Banging the cowbell harder didn't make the music any better, right? That's why it was a funny skit. And the same thing with threat intelligence, right? It's not just a matter of more sharing. It's not just a matter of having more feeds and more data and more people in the tent, right? You actually have to think of the problem as an intelligence professional and realize, right, that the paradigm we're employing just isn't getting you there from here in terms of discovering novel cyber threats and figuring out those targeted attacks in the nascent stages, right? Before it's in the news, right? That's what it means to do intelligence work, is getting inside the conspiracy and breaking it up. When I worked in counterterrorism, the best work we did were two-line news stories in AFP about some guy that was arrested in an apartment in Belgium, right? It was a great counterterrorism win. To you, it was nothing, right? It was a blip on the radar. That's good intelligence work, right? When you don't have to report to the C-suite or the board, you had a massive data breach and you're cleaning it up, and here's our great response plan. Right? You don't want to deal with the smoking crater, right? You just want to get ahead of it. So, again, right, talk about those cyber threat intelligence feeds. So if somebody has to, go through a cycle of getting hacked and doing an investigation and response and getting to the bottom of it, and it takes 208 days or some other number, I mean, somebody from Verizon told me this from the 2015 report. I haven't actually found that number in the 2015 report, but I put it in here because a Verizon rep told me. But that was a long time to wait to have data filter its way into the cyber threat intelligence feeds, right? I mean, do you really want to spot people more than 6 months of processing and all that? And while you're waiting for the update to come in with the new IPs and domain names that are bad, and adversaries having their way with you, right? Strategically, right? This isn't going to get you to the place where you're avoiding strategic surprise. And then a lot of times a third party tells you, the payment card processor saying, hey, I'm seeing a concentration of fraud coming from your company. Did you know that? And you say, well, me? No, I didn't know there was a concentration of fraud coming from me. And then you dig into it and you find out, oh, indeed, I did have something that happened in my point of sale systems or databases or whatever. So what's the coin of the realm for hackers, intelligence services, and thieves? Well, personally identifiable information. They need to get that stuff because, of course, that's how you can do identity theft and fraud left and right. PHI is even a more valuable version of the same kind of information. Financial info, email creds, social media credentials. And I'll stop there for a moment and talk about what happened with the U.S. Central Command. So U.S. CENTCOM is the military unit or command that's responsible for operating against ISIS in the Middle East. All right, well, that's good. And they have a Twitter account that they use, right, to tweet out their public affairs information. Well, somehow Twitter, their account was compromised, and ISIS started logging in as CENTCOM and posting out tweets. It's like beating yourself with your own hand, right? It's like, wow, man, this is terrible, right? We lost control of our own message, and people were saying, oh, it must have just been somebody guessed the guy's Twitter handle or did the password reset and walked through the process. I don't think so. Have you guys ever tried resetting your password on Twitter? You have to submit a DNA sample to do that. It's craziness, right? So clearly, somebody got pwned at CENTCOM, right? Somewhere along the way, somebody who had the creds, and they were probably pwned through social engineering operations using social media, right? Why? Because that's their job, right? They read that stuff. They have to. It's the human frailty of the business, right? In whatever business you're in, people are going to get pwned. So, it's not a matter of training, right? Oh, what we need is another training program to get that final 5% of the dead enders who keep clicking on spam and, going to, watering holes and getting hacked. You're not going to get there, right? You could spend $1 billion a day and you wouldn't get the last 5%, okay? So just throw that strategy out and pursue another strategy that's going to give you the leg up in this space. And then phone numbers. So all this information is kind of dual use stuff. Dual use in that you can monetize this and do a fraud activity, right? And you see a lot of that, right, that happens routinely. The other use is it's grist for the mill of espionage. This is how intelligence operators figure out who the targets are, who they ought to be, and craft those operations to gain access, to tailor them specifically to the targets they're going after. So even though it may not turn into something that's monetized, from any of these different hacks that happens, it may be very well used to make a very specific targeted attack against a key person to gain access to a network. So now I'm going to talk through some case study examples. So you had this situation with TurboTax, and at first when it happened, it was like tax season in America, and everybody thought that TurboTax was hacked. Oh God, right? That's terrible. Well, not really. Maybe there were a few TurboTax accounts where people were masquerading into them and trying to change, the bank account info of where the refund went. But that was the very minimal sort of amount of that was happening. What was really happening is information was being used to essentially just use TurboTax as a vessel. PII was being filed into TurboTax and submitted to the different state IRS agencies, right, the tax agencies, to get refunds and have it credited to debit cards or what have you. Now that was a process that was really hard to detect because it wasn't really hacking per se, right? A lot of the people didn't even necessarily file their taxes online before, right? What if you just had the information but no one had ever availed themselves of online filing? This is the first time, right? So what did they do? Well, you have to pick this, security question, right? And you have to do this, two-factor authentication thing and, get a text message. Dude, if it's the first time, you just put in your own number, right? This is not rocket science, right? So this is what was happening, right? Is they were able to monetize, a substantial amount of that PII because it was essentially ungoverned territory, and they had the targets, the people who were the target, like the citizens who they were filing the tax returns on behalf of, had never availed themselves of the service in the first place. So where does all that PII come from? Well, you probably all remember the Anthem breach of a major U.S. healthcare provider. And if you look at the kind of data that was breached in Anthem, what do you find? Names, social security numbers, date of birth, addresses, phone numbers, email addresses, income information. I wager to guess the number of children you have is in there. That kind of information looks suspiciously similar to what's required to fill out your taxes in America, okay? So there you go, right? You can easily see the hop, skip, and a jump from this kind of pilfered PII to the monetized fraud activity that was happening and the stealing of data via TurboTax as the vessel to achieve that end. So if you think about this as the attacker, right? You don't have to. You just have to string together. It's kind of like the Unix utilities, right? You can run ls and pipe it to grep. That's easy, right? But it's just like the hackers doing here. It's like they hacked Anthem and then they piped it over to TurboTax and monetized it and turned it into cash, right? That's really what was happening. It wasn't super complicated. Now, let's turn back now to this concept of threat intelligence and how you might have used, at least the current paradigm to make progress in detecting this, and then how you could employ other paradigms. So here's the thing. There was spear phishing with the we11point.com domain. What's the significance of that? Well, WellPoint was a company that merged with Anthem, and they kind of changed the name. Anthem is the bigger company. But they used to have a domain, wellpoint.com, which was core to the business functions of the medical company. So the attacker went ahead and purchased a variant of that domain name, and then, of course, used it in social engineering operations. So you're left with that, overriding question of, well, did they know that this domain name was malicious at the time? When they were getting hacked, right? Was that in the cyber threat intelligence feed, and could they have cross-referenced it successfully in their security logs to have concluded they were under threat? No, don't think so. Now there's people that will say, well, there's some company new out there, but they had redacted it in some other report. What is that, like partial credit? Dude, it doesn't help, right? I don't care that somebody else knew somewhere else. The fact is, if you're the security guy responsible for protecting that part of the network, you have to have a strategy that doesn't depend on serendipity to get the job done, right? You have to do it yourself, and you have to have your own discipline to figure out what's real and not real, and normal and not normal in your environment. And then you'll see that the DRAGONFLY APT malware family was used. Okay, then there's been analysis done on those pieces of malware, and there's Yara signatures for them. That's good, right? Were those Yara signatures available when they were pwned initially, at Anthem? No, they were not available, right? That's the whole point, right? You're watching the news, right? If I'm watching CNN and I say, oh, look, somebody's driving Chrysler Town and Country down the street, it looks just like mine, right? Like, that's not a method to protect my car from being stolen, right? Now I just know my car was stolen. And that's the similarity of if you go through and just employ the stuff. It's not a leading indicator. It's definitely a trailing indicator of exploitation. Okay, and this is what the diagram looks like. You have this mapping between, like HR solutions and the VPN address and all this to the real WellPoint domains that were used by the company for business. So you can see it wasn't just a sort of a one and done social engineering endeavor, right? They actually went through and took time to think about how to map critical systems to the actual systems that were used for mission. And then, of course, how would they architect a social engineering op to grab creds and get in behind the perimeter defenses. So one of my colleagues at Darktrace had made this statement back, I guess it was in late 2014. And he was like, look, the hackers have been really nice people. And he was saying that about JP Morgan. There was pretty good access inside JP Morgan, but they didn't really do anything to speak of with it. Maybe we're waiting to see what kind of fraud happened, but they could have done a lot more damage to the financial system if they had just been destructive. And they didn't do that. But we sort of thought, man, the other shoe's going to drop somewhere, someday around here. And then, of course, in short succession afterward, we did see a more aggressive approach taken with Sony. And this is the last screen that a lot of Sony employees saw before they ended up having their master boot record deleted. It was attributed to the North Koreans by the U.S. government, and you can see, but based on that terrible art, it must be the North Koreans. I mean, geez, look at that, it's awful. But the moral of the story here is it's kind of like an example of real cyber terrorism, if you think about it, right? They did a cyber operation and attempted to intimidate real-world people and change their real-world behavior, right? That's the definition of political terrorism and cyber terrorism, because they're using a cyber tactic. So this is, in my mind, sort of the first real example of a cyber terrorism attack with the purpose of influencing, behavior. And of course, the U.S. government did recognize it as something certainly offensive, but didn't necessarily, left it in kind of an ambiguous state in terms of their response. One of the things that was said by the FBI in the aftermath of the Sony attack was, oh, this incident appears to have been conducted using techniques that went undetected by industry standard antivirus. I said to myself, man, that could have appeared on every single data breach, as far back as the eye can see, and years, right? It's just there. It's omnipresent. Getting those signature updates and things like that. It's never going to be in a position that's going to be a leading indicator in these scenarios. And then the last, one I'm going to talk about here in terms of a recent case study is the OPM data breach. And what you're looking at on the left is the letter I received, right? Because I had a clearance for the government, right? Here it is to James Penrose, telling me that, hey, all your information was compromised in a major data breach and blah, blah, blah. Hey, you want credit security monitoring? That will help, right, for you and your family? Not really. A lot of stuff was compromised, and I'll get into that in a minute. But the thing that you need to know is the trust between OPM, right, the office responsible for holding the clearance data and the adjudication information. What's that mean? Well, they come to my neighbors and say, do you know Jim? Yeah? Jim, he's okay. he drinks a little bit. Sometimes he gets belligerent, but most of the time he's nice. They write all that down, right? And they stick it into my file, and they do that all electronically, right? And maybe OPM doesn't have enough investigators to do all that, right? Because there's an awful lot of people with clearances in America. So what do? Subcontract it out, right? They hire a contractor. And for the contractor to enter that same information, what do they need to do? Yeah, they got to have VPN credentials. They got to have access to the portal. They got to be able to file that stuff, right? So the attacker says, the wall's kind of high over there at OPM, and they're kind of like wise to the fact that they're a target because they held all these security clearances. Why don't we go pop Keypoint Government Solutions instead, right? Because they're off in Colorado or someplace far away, and I mean, who cares about little old me in Colorado? I'm just a subcontractor for the OPM, right? So they get compromised, and credentials are stolen, right, from those people that do that work, and the attacker rides back into the OPM systems. Of course, surveys, what do I have access to with these credentials, and then eventually, goes through that process I had on the basic bag of tricks slide, figuring out what they can get to by enumeration, exploiting some other machines, and then laying down backdoors and making a sustained path to exfiltrate data out of the network. And you'll hear people say, if they just used encryption, encryption, that would have been the key. Yeah, I mean, masquerade operations, right? Remember, when someone uses valid credentials, right, the mission system decrypts the data and shows it to them, right? Because, you have authorization to see it. So when you think of, in terms of encryption, you really have to think of the whole, sort of cryptography and security argument about, authenticity and non-repudiation and all the other stuff, not just confidentiality, right? Showing somebody a blob of ciphertext, okay, great, but that's not necessarily the size of the game, right? If they've got credentials that are going to open it up and bring it up in the portal and give them full access. So, and then the other thing, with these believed to be Chinese state-sponsored attackers is, it causes a huge threat, right? This is a threat that's far-reaching beyond cyber, right? Now think of this in real terms, right? They know, every foreign associate I've ever had, right? I had to report all that. They know all my email accounts and everything else because I had to report that now too. They even have my fingerprints right down to that level of information. Up to 32 million people in America who have top security clearances. Geez, just imagine trying to cross a border, right? If you were on a sensitive mission, right? With that kind of data being compromised, right? You going to issue new fingers or fingerprints? Get your 3D printer going. I mean, I don't know. Maybe it's possible, right? But this is an awful lot of ridiculousness, right? Because you can't take care of your business in cyber, right? And you have to be able to see these kinds of intrusions. You're not going to take a 122-page form, 32 million of those plus fingerprints. You're not just going to low and slow that data out of the network, right? As people like to say, well, what if it was low and slow? Okay, yeah, it would have taken 150 years to get all that data out if it was low and slow, right? Here's this terabytes of data sucked out. It obviously happened more quickly. Should have been noticed by someone somewhere, but wasn't. Okay. And then I do want to take a little detour now into Dragonfly and Energetic Bear. So I've talked a lot about the enterprise, the corporate IT, enterprise IT environment. Now what I'm going to do is switch contexts and talk about industrial control systems. So what I'd like to show you here with the industrial control systems is the approach that was taken, presumably by the Russians in this case, to compromise energy companies and to gain sustained access moving forward. So they realized again that the enclaves that are set up to protect industrial control systems networks, SCADA networks from the enterprise IT network are usually pretty substantial, right? There's an attempt at air gapping still, and where you don't have air gaps, right, you have these enclave controllers that are going to do one-way transfers and blah, blah, blah. There's a huge, discipline around that, right, in terms of trying to manage it. But so they realized, it's just kind of hard to hack your way in from the outside in those scenarios. So they got smart, and what they did is they said, well, let's go after those industrial control system companies, because the companies, they have to provide updates to their different systems that they use, right? So what they did is they went ahead and popped the companies and posted on the companies' websites, the updates, right, that would be downloaded and brought in. And then, they used this rat that they call Havex. There was just a string Havex in the code that was, you could see through reverse engineering of the rat. That's why it's called Havex. And then they just kept modifying that to their purposes, and so they could do their enumeration and possibly run code inside. So could Dragonfly have done better? I'll throw that out there as a concept and a question. And then is there something else like it out there right now, undetected, just underneath the radar? Maybe it's persisting out there and it's going to stay out there for a while. Okay, so what did it look like in the real world? well, this is what it looked like. These are the websites from the real ICS providers. And it's like these download links had not only the real software to update the ICS system, but also had the malware attached to it that was the malicious software that would give the Havex, a way to run inside the network, and so it could do its enumeration, things like that. So they obviously went to a lot of trouble, right, to hack these ICS companies, to get this level of access to the web server, and to attach the malware to those update binaries. Now, again, keep in the back of your head, could they have done better than this, right? It was just kind of a, hey, let's just jam these two things together, throw it up on the website, run up the flagpole, if somebody salutes, we're set, right? So it was kind of like I think they were just trying to see if this tactic works. What could they do with the Trojan, the Havex Trojan? Well, the Havex Trojan was able to, scan once it got on the network and look for these protocols that are unique to SCADA and industrial control systems, RS Links and Modbus and Siemens PLC and SIP and a bunch of other things. This allows them to detect the presence of those actual big industrial pieces of equipment, whether they be generators, turbines, you name it. All those things that we use to keep the lights on or run a steel mill or make cars, all that stuff is run by these different protocols. So when it's out there scanning and enumerating, it's going to be able to identify those different pieces of equipment that are out there on the network and it can talk to. And then, of course, the last part, which is really, I think, the most sinister part, is this bottom, has the ability to run programs and scripts on the attacker's command, arbitrary programs and scripts. So when I worked for the Department of Defense, we always had this sort of pithy little saying, computer network attack is a click away, or CNA is a click away, right? Why is that? Why do we used to say that? Well, this is exactly why. Once you have malware and you're out there in a network, if you can run arbitrary code, you can be destructive, right? It's literally just a matter of changing the task that's given through command and control. And this is exactly the reason why you don't want to let this kind of adversary persist in your network, because on that rainy day when they need to take advantage, this is the tactic that would be employed to do so. How did they do command and control with Havex? Well, they went and they didn't just go out to GoDaddy and buy some brand new domain for the occasion. They went out and used sites that already had real purposes and already had their own history. This particular website was a real website. I got this from the Wayback Machine from when Havex was using it for operational command and control. So if you went there and asked it, for a web page, it would give you the real web page, and you could do whatever the person who runs that site wanted to do with it, sell drugs. But if you send it certain URIs and different strings, well, guess what? It would give you back Havex command and control instead, right? It would give instructions and task out the Trojan to do different stuff, right? So you could see that's a pretty, advanced tactic of leaving it sort of in the state where the real users and the real history of the website is intact and it still has credibility, but then it's also being abused in that way maliciously. So it's not as easy to say, thumbs up or thumbs down on whether a site's good or bad. Sometimes it's in that gray state in the middle and you can't really tell. And then Trend Micro finds in the wild this updated version of Havex. Now it's still a self-signed certificate on the malware, but what you see here is they jammed in IBM as the issuer here. They just type that in, and hopefully people would just squint at it and say, meh, okay, this is real. But the thing about it is, even if you don't, that's not really going to work, right? Because it doesn't really pass the sniff test from a certificate validation. Look at the strategy the adversary is employing, right? Remember my question: could they be there right now? Could they be under the radar? Well, I mean, the answer has to be absolutely, right? Tactics-wise, that they went after the companies, right? Now you see that they're trying to sign certificates in a certain way, right, to be surreptitious. Is it not reasonable to assume that they've endeavored to get the signing certificates of those ICS companies? We know they can get inside, right? I've already shown you that, right? So if they have the signing certificate and they're able to sign software, maybe they can even sort of have a two-stage loader or something put into a real software update. Man, that is hard to ferret out now, because they're going to be even lower and slower and further under the radar. And of course, having technologists and operators walk in these updates on purpose across enclave boundaries and things like that, only makes it worse when it comes to the approach the attacker's taking. At the bottom here, you can see a command and control post format, right? This is plain text HTTP. Great, right? Easy to signature. We could probably write a signature right now for that. The only problem is just one little flip of the HTTPS bit there, and now they're going SSL, and you're in an SSL inspection regime issue, and you got to deal with that. So it's easy for them to just make some improvements and really fly under the radar. Okay. Now I'm going to take a little bit of a step back. I talked about a lot of case studies. I think you sort of get the point of why the current paradigm is having, issues in terms of detecting these threats before we have a crisis on our hands. So what I'm going to do now is talk about a little higher level. So the cyber criminal, right? Look, time is on their side. They're completely brazen and tenacious. They don't care, right? If you catch a cyber criminal with endpoint AV, do they get all glum and embarrassed and go away and slink away because they feel stupid? They don't care. They're just going to try again, right? Try again. They're completely tenacious in that way. And everybody's looking to just exploit human weakness and frailty. That's the point, right? We all know that humans are the problem. You can't train your way out of the situation, right? The humans are going to have to try to get their job done, and while they endeavor to do that, they're going to end up getting themselves hacked and give a beachhead to the adversary. And at the same time, a lot of times those credentials that get stolen, authorized access, right, will end up looking like an insider threat in those scenarios. And people think, well, I'll bolt on an insider program on the end of security. It's got to be integrated, right? You have to think of the insider program in the same way you think of your security, cybersecurity efforts, cyber intelligence efforts. Because a lot of times those insiders, just like your key point government solutions, right, when those big masquerades were happening and they were sucking data out, with authorized credentials, it looked like an insider, right, abusing privilege. But at the end of the day, it was an outsider, who had set up a different path of exfiltration. Now, finally, what makes an APT advanced? Look, APTs have a lot of money. It's big resources. They're able to build a laboratory, look at what the best practices are, bring in those pieces of equipment and test them, right? Why do they do that, right? Well, they want to move to the right and see if they can maneuver around your IPS, right? Oh, great, I've used my tactics and now the IPS is no longer going off, right? Then they come inside and say, oh, I got caught by endpoint AV. Well, let me just rewicker this or obfuscate, polymorphic malware, whatever, right? Psst, now I can get around endpoint AV, right? So now they've realized, oh, if I use these different tactics, right, I can maneuver to the right and left, and now I'm clear, and I'm not going to trip off what would be the best practices security stack when I come in. And then they also, I'll give a nod there to their experts that they might be able to take a known vulnerability and implement an exploit against it, even though nobody else has seen an exploit in the wild, and they may be able to keep that under their hat as a 0 day. But, let's leave that out there as a possibility, but not necessarily the biggest threat in this regard. The paradigm that I'm talking about is literally this testing paradigm, right? They set up the lab and they test it, and that's why they get around you, right? Because they know. And of course, what's the last step after they've figured out how to get around the products? Well, they take your favorite cyber threat intelligence feed and they cross-reference the IPs they're going to use and the domain names and the emails and everything else, right? Well, why do they do that, right? Because they're not stupid, right? I mean, everybody knows the tactics that we're employing, right? We talk about it in conferences constantly, and we're going to optimize that process. But the adversary knows that, and they can actually do blind tests on it, right? So the fact that they can blindly test your paradigm is the reason they're always going to get around you, right? That's the fundamental reason that we're not going to stop them with the current paradigm in spite of all optimization. So what can we do? You have one thing that they're not going to have in their lab, right? It's the way your people behave. It's the way they use computers and devices in your network, right? So think about this for a minute, right? You've got people using Android tablets and iPads and multifunction device printers, scanner, copiers, all those things. The way they use the SharePoint and your mission apps, the way they're behaving is something that is not really susceptible to importation into this lab to test, right? Think about it. It's intractable, right? So say if you have your Gigamon monitoring fabric, for instance, right? And you say, I've got a 10 gigabit per second, monitoring port, that I look at for my environment that represents all the stuff I just mentioned. Okay, great. That's a lot of data. Think about that for a minute. Oh, that's a lot of data. Is it tractable for these guys to bring all that data into their lab and test against it and figure out, well, here's how you normally behave, right? Now that I know how you normally behave, I can behave this way and move that way and maneuver around you? Not really, right? It's not really tractable for them to do that. It's just like the concept of good encryption, right? I mean, we can have a discussion about an encryption algorithm. You can understand it and master the encryption algorithm. Hey, this is how AES works. That's great, Jim. I understand how AES works. Then I show you a ciphertext or a cryptogram that you don't know the symmetric key for, and you say, I can't brute force attack that, come up with the plain text, right? Yes, that's because it's intractable, right? This is what you need to do to break the adversary's tactics here, right? You have to use systems and technology, right, in the cyber security technological arms race here that takes advantage of your own uniqueness, right? Because if you don't take advantage of your own uniqueness, you're just going to fall victim to the same old paradigm. They have lather, rinse, repeat. They just do the same thing over and over again, and then we're surprised at the outcome, right? It's the definition of insanity, right? We're not going to get there from here. You have to bring something new to the fight. Then you, of course, have to put people on that new thing, right, to look at what's coming out and act on it. So again, I've already said this. What we're doing right now with the current paradigm is we're doing a matching exercise, like you're in elementary school. Well, if I knew yesterday what I knew today, I would have detected it. Well, that's the excuse I assigned to the logic bomb, right? I had all the tools, but I didn't have them configured properly. Well, that's what I assigned to the data breach. I had all the events and alerts, I just didn't know which ones mattered, right? And that's how we had the insider attack. And then you go through matching that, and that's what you tell your bosses, right, when something happens. You can't get around it by just optimizing the 80% solution, okay? You could be perfect at your 80% solution, execute your program flawlessly, and still fail, okay? Because it's not intelligence, right? You've constructed a mechanism to watch cyber news and then respond to cyber news, right? You have to have the discipline of intelligence to take advantage of data that gives you leads on the unknowns about the uniqueness and the difference of what's happening in your network every day. So, how do you make the cyber intelligence a discipline, like I just described? Well, you have to get those timely indications of warning before a crisis, right? So don't wait for somebody else to get hacked and a big data breach to occur, and then 6 months later it show up in your cyber threat intelligence feed, right? We know that's going to be a day late and a dollar short. Understand the tradecraft of the adversaries. You have to go in assuming they're going to use clean infrastructure addresses, IP addresses, domain names, things like that, right? Assume they've tested your iSight feed and made sure that, oh, it's not in there. Great, I can run the attack, right? Assume that they're going to obfuscate their malware to try to get around you past endpoint and sandboxing defenses. And then finally, the insider threat behaviors that you see, abusing authorized access may very well be an external attacker too, right? It could be a legitimate insider, right, who's really an insider threat, but it could also be an external attacker who's gotten this, spirited their way into the network and are using those authorized creds. So I know our natural instincts are to say it ain't so, right? When you work in one of these op centers or you're in charge of security, right, and you see an insider doing something weird, you don't want to believe it, right? This is a discipline, right? You have to investigate these things. You have to have a means to prioritize what's weird, what you work on, and why. And you have to force yourself to spend time on it, right? Because the pile of bad is very big, right? And you work on the pile of bad all day long, and then maybe you've got 20 minutes at the end of the day after the pile of bad zero to go look at weird. The weird is what's going to get you, right? So if it's bad, you have to automate to the extent practical, right? You have to make capacity for the wetware of your smart people to go look at weird, because weird is going to be where the targeted attacks come from, the APTs and those unique approaches. You have to create a security stack that's contextually aware. What do I mean by that? It's what I had just said about your own uniqueness, right? You have to be able to develop a pattern of life, right, for the way people are behaving in the network, sort of just like your human body, right, can distinguish between what's good and bad, right? I can shake your hands here, and if I get sick, it's like not a false negative, right? It's not a terminal event. I don't die tomorrow, right? I just get a sniffle and we move on, right? You have to think in the same resilient mindset when it comes to cyber intelligence. You have to implement that advanced threat detection, right? Anomaly detection that's going to give you the things to start from, right? The scratch to start your investigation from. You have to be able to prioritize weird, right? It's a big stack of weird, right? Where do I start? Do I just sort of pick up couch pillows and look for change, right? That's not a technique. That's not a good technique, right? To figure out where to do your hunting in the pile of weird. You have to devote substantial resources to anomalies in your enterprise. I know that people don't necessarily have a staff that big, right? Understood, right? But realize that maybe you need to retain help or somebody in a contract that could be brought in to do kind of hunting activities, or at least run in an overwatch position for the anomalies in your network and be able to provide you some leads on a regular basis to say, why don't you look at this? Take a second look over here, right? Because it's definitely not normal. I don't know it's malicious, but I know it's not normal, right? That's usually the bump in the night that you have to go look at. And then finally, you have to hunt when you get this as an indication, right? Going out and just re-imaging a computer, something weird going on here. I'm just going to re-image it. Let's just get that thing clean. Really? Is that going to clean it out? Do you think you got all the tendrils of an advanced attacker, right? The guys that run the Havex, energetic bear operations. Do you think re-imaging one box keeps them out? No, right? You have to have hunters. You have to have people who are experienced in investigating the tendrils of that kind of activity. And again, if you don't have the staff, you're not going to be able to develop that. Work with somebody who can and use them in that regard. So I'll leave you with one, sort of final thought on this. The Blue Jays did really, they've had a good year, right? I can't remember. Did they win or lose last night? I had to go to sleep because I got in at like 3 a.m. They win or lose? Good, they won? Fantastic. So if you think about a baseball analogy in this world in cyber resilience, you know, you don't have to go out and ask the pitcher to throw a perfect game every night as the coach to win a baseball game, right? You just need to keep the other team from scoring runs. Now, there's a little bit of a bend not break model built into baseball, okay? Think about that. You know, you can walk a guy and he can get on first base. Somebody can hit a single and that guy might go to third. You know, you got first and third. The other team hasn't scored a run yet, right? And as long as your defense is good enough to strand those runners on the bases, you could still win in this world, okay? You could still win. And you could still be ahead of it from an intelligence perspective and be able to avoid becoming, you know, a person in the news that becomes a highlight, right, for someone else like me to talk about later. So that's the thing that I'd sort of give you, you know, sort of the call, you know, to action on here when it comes to the cyber intelligence as a discipline is think of yourselves in a resilient way, right? You're not going to see every initial exploit. You're just not going to see it. There's too many ways and new novel things that could be done. But at the end of the day, an adversary has to have command and control, right? They have to be able to strive and get to a key resource or to a key person, key level of access. And Rome's never built in a day, right? They're not going to be done with it, right, with just one exploit, one and done on one guy or one gal, right? So as long as you build a mechanism, right, to be able to see where to start and where to go next, you'll be able to be resilient and figure out those threats early enough in the process that it hasn't become a crisis and strand those runners on base, right? So that's what we need to do. And to discover novel cyber threats, you have to have a focus in that regard and, of course, put people against it. And, you know, whether it's the Canadian military or intelligence services or the U.S., you know, military intelligence services, we've got an awful lot of veterans who really understand cyber, right, really well. They've been operational practitioners, and they may not have degrees from the biggest name schools. They might have been enlisted or senior enlisted folks. Give them a chance. Think about them and consider them as joining your team, because they may be the ones that are your secret sauce to get into this space, because they had to live it, right? They had to do intelligence in the real world, right? And so a lot of times their lives depended on it, right? So if you turn to them for advice and help in this, you're going to end up hiring some really great people. So I'll stop there for questions. So the question was, what about honeypotting as a strategy to help divert attackers and learn about their tactics and techniques? Yeah, I think a lot of people have that employed as a strategy to get some indications as to who's after them and why. I think from a honeypotting perspective, you know, you want to think comprehensively about a honeypot, right? So instead of just saying, I'm going to leave a window ajar over here on the side and see who, you know, finds their way in that window, right? From an outside-in scanning perspective, like, you know, oh, they can get past my firewall, and they found out I had a vulnerable version of some PHP on a web server that's internet-facing, right? You know, that's a kind of like a honeypot, you know, might be discovered that way by an external attacker. But in reality, right, and maybe people do run their honeypots this way, I'm just not super aware of it, is that, you know, you really need to, like, take those spear phishing messages and all the stuff that's really the targeted social engineering attacks. And if you're going to run good honeypots, right, you need to execute some of those on purpose, right, in sort of a cloistered environment to see what happens and where they go from there, right? Now, if you run it in a walled garden and you don't let them go anywhere, what's going to happen is, you know, the attacker may get wise to you, right? You sort of end up in this spy versus spy kind of counterintelligence situation where they might sort of mislead you in a certain way about their tactics. So if they realize they can never really get anywhere and they think they're in a honeypot, right? Especially if you do a lot of virtualization for the honeypot, you know, that may be very well figured out by an adversary, right? So just bear that in mind, right? I mean, I think the honeypots are going to be very useful against, I would say, low to mid-tier attackers, right? But when you get up to the upper echelons, right, you could get deceived and thrown off by a sophisticated actor who's purposely kind of feeding you misinformation with your honeypot. So that's the way I'd say. Go ahead. Absolutely. So that's a great example of another approach that takes advantage of the social engineering aspects of using a honeypot. Now, the thing about having a fake executive and a fake, executive assistant is, how do you distinguish between, them and the real, if it's somebody you can look up on the web, right? Because a common tactic is, whether it's LinkedIn intelligence or whatever, right? An attacker will go look to see who's the person in charge or highly connected individual in your network, and then they'll target them that way, right? They'll figure out who's connected and go after you in that respect. So, are you gonna create and maintain fake personas, or are they going to be, other accounts assigned to real people, right? That are the ones that are just used for honeypotting. Those are all tactics you can talk about, but it's important to realize that the real users, right? Like say you have some honeypot accounts associated with an executive, right? Maybe it's even a security executive, right? They're going to be, they've got these alternative personas and personalities that you have to think about in that case, right? And how you're going to manage the alternative personas and personalities and keep it straight for honeypot purposes. So it's just it becomes complex is what I'm trying to say. Yep. Absolutely, yeah. I mean, so, a plug for Darktrace, right? You could come look at us on the floor, right? That's one of the things that we are able to do, right? Machine learning, unsupervised machine learning, figures out your uniqueness, tells you what's different, right? So come down and see us. There's a bunch of other people that do it too. The question is who's the best at it, right? And why? How do you prioritize the stack of weird? I mean, I think the most important thing to do is you got to have what would be considered an advanced threat detection capability is what it comes down to, right? So anything that fits into that category of advanced threat detection, those might be appliances, those might be, big data analytics capabilities. There's going to be a lot of people who say, hey, I can figure out what weird is, right? And I can prioritize what weird is. Now, think about the distinction between things that are run in a batch mode, like a cloud job overnight as an example, right? That might be a way to figure out what's weird and concentrate on it. But the problem you run into then is, what if the cloud job crashes? What if you've got problems with data being adulterated, right? That's coming in from logs, right? What if somebody cleaned up the logs, right? And then you processed it on the logs and missed a correlation, right? So when you're looking at tools that do that, just consider that and bear that in mind, right? Am I in a situation where I could have a garbage in, garbage out scenario, right? Somebody had cleaned up a log and then I didn't see it. Okay, thank you very much.